Hey everyone, my name is Emily Fort. I'm one of the new PGY2s, and I wanted to do a quick video for you guys to discuss system-based rounding in the MICU. So this is a form that I made back in med school and have adapted over the years. Just helps me keep my thoughts organized. You're welcome to download it. We'll try to attach it to this video and make it available for all of you. So the first page has room for you to write two different sets of patient data. And that's the one I'm showing you right now. The second page of the document is the same system-based format, but just a little spread out if you write bigger or just want some more space. And then I added a little to-do list. So whichever one works better for your mental process is great. Feel free to use them. Usually I'll start the day by printing a couple of these first page, and then I have a page for each of my patients. I will briefly kind of describe the use of this form. Again, don't use it if you don't want to, but hopefully at least understanding the way we do system-based rounding will be helpful. Usually when you're on wards, you'll be doing a problem-based kind of SOAP presentation. Sometimes in the MICU, you will still do that, especially in the simpler patients, but a system-based rounding is depending on the attending, and it allows you to be very comprehensive. I actually find it very helpful, but it's a hard transition when you're going from a SOAP format to system-based rounding. The biggest difference is that you end up sharing the different data points under a system instead of all lumped together. And so you'll see throughout this form, there's areas for you to plug in information. Blood pressure and heart rate range, for example, the vent settings. Labs, you can put your electrolyte panel, your CBC, culture results here. I end up writing kind of scratch notes on the sides to talk about imaging wherever it's most appropriate in the presentation. So as far as the way that you would go about your system-based rounding, I try to remember almost a SOAP format under each of the headers. Now, usually in the ICU, your patients won't have a lot to say subjectively about every single system. But for example, if you're treating someone with meningitis and you're wondering neurologically, are they having vision changes, headache? You might mention that at the very beginning of your neuro presentation before you go into the objective data and eventually their assessment and plan. A few other things I'd like to touch on while we're here. If some of these data points are not pertinent to your patient or are just distracting to you, don't use them. It's just a guideline for you to be able to think through some of the things you may have forgotten or that you want to reference quickly and may not know off the top of your head so that your rounding experience is easier. So going from the top here, you will put the room number, patient name. I use that just because it's helpful to know where my patients are, but I usually do have a list of the whole team with the patient's rooms with me as well. If I were to go about a system-based rounding, again, thinking through objective assessment plan, it might look something like this. I have a 50-year-old gentleman who's presenting with altered mental status. Overnight events include patient becoming more hypotensive and requiring increased blood pressure support. As I discuss his neuro exam, this patient is a GCS of 7, a RAS of -1. He doesn't give you any subjective, so I didn't need to say anything there. I can discuss that he, on my physical exam, has equal pupils, reactive to light. His gag reflex is present. He withdraws from pain. He's not following commands, but opening his eyes spontaneously. And then I can discuss currently, the patient is on 50 of fentanyl. We wean down the propofol. We can discuss any other data points that we might have from a neuro standpoint. His ammonia level was within normal limits. B12, TSH, normal, for example. Alcohol level was positive, and his UDS was positive for methamphetamine and cocaine. Under my assessment plan for this altered mental status, likely secondary to drug intoxication, for example, versus seizure. And then discussing my plan for that. We're going to get an EEG today. Neuro was consulted from the ED. They've signed off, for example. Moving on to my cardiovascular exam, I'll discuss the patient's vitals for the last 24 hours in a range format. I will then discuss if I have any EKG findings that I want to just talk about, echo findings, my physical exam, obviously, and then go into my assessment plan. You will spend a lot of time on the cardiovascular portion of your assessment plan, and that is because typically we talk about shock under cardiovascular. Now, you can go through all the etiologies of shock, and that is not what this video is for. But just to explain, you may end up saying, number one problem, shock. Etiologies would be cardiogenic shock versus septic shock. And I'll talk more about his septic shock in the ID portion. Or you can go ahead and talk about it here. It's part of the complicated nature of the system-based rounding because there's some overlap in our systems. But as a general reference, that's where you'll talk about shock, which is a problem. That and hypoxic respiratory failure will be kind of bread and butter of your ICU experience. I'll talk about pulmonology, his examination. So there's crackles in the bilateral bases. The patient has been on ventilated since admission on minimal vent settings. Maybe you can say FiO 230, PEEP of 5. He's breathing over the vent when that's, relevant. Talk about their ABG, again, talk about any imaging findings, and then your assessment plan for the day. So without doing this for every single section, I think you kind of gather what an example would be. The FEN is fluids, electrolytes, renal. And so oftentimes patients aren't going to have any subjective complaints here, so you can talk about their objective data. So objectively on their BMP, they were hyperkalemic, they have uptrending creatinine, worsening AKI, their MAG was low, which was repleted. As far as their I's and O's, they're net negative of 1 liter in the last 24 hours, for example. And being able to discuss then my assessment plan for their AKI, my assessment plan for their electrolyte derangements. Then we can talk about their GI. Oftentimes for our patients, this would be where you're talking about the GI bleeder. Did they get scoped? What's our plan from a GI prophylaxis standpoint? Whether they are having, new diarrhea that we need to start working up. Obviously, that would all come under GI. Moving down, the other data points that you'll end up touching on. Under heme, you'll put your CBC, obviously talk about anemia, if you didn't already mention it in the GI section. Talk about thrombocytopenia, did they need any transfusions? Going to ID, objectively, their Tmax overnight was this. They are currently growing this in their blood cultures, and we're pending these cultures. Imaging showed XYZ. As far as my assessment plan for their septic shock, for example, when we talk about here what you want to do with their antibiotics, these patients need source control. Are there any consultants on board? Lines and tubes are something really important in ICU that we don't spend a lot of time talking about on wards. You don't have to write down every single date for every single tube they have unless it's helpful and it allows you to keep track of things. Something I do write down is if I want to address a specific line that day. For example, the patient has a central line that has been in their femoral vein for 10 days, and I need to address that today and discuss, do we still need that line? Do we need to change that line? Can we remove that line? Under MSK and skin, we don't have a lot to talk about under this section every time, but this is where you would mention, are the patients ready for PT/OT? Where's wound consulted? Are there any recommendations that we need to follow up on? And I'm sorry, I skipped endo. For this section, being able to objectively talk about what the patient's hormone values were, if we were checking TSH, if we were checking cortisol, what has their glucose been in the last 24 hours, and then assessment plan. Are we supplementing anything? Are they on stress dose steroids that we would need to discuss in this section from a shock perspective? Do they need changes on their insulin regimen? And then from a psychosocial kind of wrapping everything up, this is where I say, big picture, the patient is ready for downgrade from the ICU, or the patient is looking worse and we need to have a family discussion. I did talk to their family today and they'll be coming in at 1 o'clock for a family meeting. Being able to have their code status and their POA is for you, not something that you need to present during rounds every day. I think that pretty much sums up the system-based rounding. So again, trying to remember system by system, it kind of goes head to toe. Don't hesitate to use talking about their cardiovascular exam now, going into their lung exam as your transition points, for example. You can mention as you're trying to move on from their GI, maybe there's nothing to say in GU, and you say from a hematologic standpoint. Being able to find some of those transitions, make the presentation smooth for you, and make sure that you don't miss things throughout the day. Let me know if you guys have any questions, and best of luck.